Imagine pouring your heart and soul into a grand gesture, a gift meant to last forever. George C. Boldt, a millionaire with a boundless love for his wife, set out to build her a castle, an island fortress where she would reign as his queen. But just days before the final stone was laid, Louise, the woman it was all for, died unexpectedly. And so, the castle was abandoned, left to crumble in sorrow. What should have been a symbol of eternal love became a haunting monument to grief. What happened next is a story of dreams unfulfilled, lives ruined, and a legacy that still lingers in the air today. George Charles Boldt arrived in America with nothing but ambition burning in his chest. The year was 1864. He was 13 years old. Prussia felt like a prison to the young boy, a place where birth determined destiny. So he crossed an ocean, carrying dreams bigger than the small cloth bag that held his possessions. New York City swallowed him whole. He worked in kitchens, hot, brutal places where the air hung thick with grease and shouting. He washed dishes until his hands cracked and bled. He peeled potatoes until his fingers went numb. He learned English between shifts, one painful word at a time. The other boys mocked his accent. The men ignored him entirely, but George noticed things others missed. He watched how wealthy guests entered dining rooms, the way they expected certain courtesies, the invisible language of service that separated good establishments from great ones. He studied the rhythm of hospitality like a scholar studies scripture. Every gesture mattered, every detail counted. By his 20s, he managed a small hotel. By his 30s, he owned the most prestigious club in Philadelphia, and then came Louise. Louise Augusta Carey walked into his life like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She was the daughter of a successful businessman, educated and refined. George fell for her with the intensity of a man who had spent his entire life chasing something he couldn't name. In Louise, he found it. They married in 1877. She became his partner in every sense. When George bought the Bellevue Hotel in Philadelphia, Louise transformed it from a building into an experience. She understood luxury not as excess, but as perfection in every detail. Fresh flowers in every room. Linens changed daily. Staff trained to anticipate needs before guests spoke them. Together they built an empire. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York became their masterpiece. George served as its proprietor, Louise as his invisible architect of elegance. They transformed American hospitality. Presidents dined there. Millionaires kept permanent suites. The Waldorf wasn't just a hotel. It was a declaration that America could rival European sophistication. Money poured in like water. By 1900, George C. Boldt stood among the wealthiest men in America. But wealth meant nothing compared to what he felt for Louise. She gave him 4 children. She gave him purpose. She gave him a life that felt like more than survival. He wanted to give her something eternal. The Thousand Islands region of the St. Lawrence River stretched between New York and Canada, like scattered emeralds on blue silk. Wealthy families built summer cottages there, escaping the suffocating heat of cities. George purchased Hart Island in 1900. The island was small, barely 7 acres, wild and undeveloped. Louise loved it immediately. George saw a possibility in her smile. He hired architects. He drew up plans, not for a cottage, not for a mansion, but for a castle, a real castle, built with the same ambition that drove him across an ocean as a boy. He would reshape the island itself. Tons of soil would be brought in to expand the landmass. The island would be sculpted into the shape of a heart, Louise's heart. Every stone, every tower, every archway would serve as a testament to his devotion. She would have gardens designed by the finest landscapers. She would have a powerhouse to generate electricity. She would have everything, and it would all be wrapped in stone that would last 1,000 years. He named it Boldt Castle. The plans were staggering in their ambition. 120 rooms spread across 6 floors, towers reaching toward the sky like fingers grasping for heaven, Italian gardens with marble sculptures imported from Europe, a yacht house larger than most people's homes, tunnels connecting buildings underground, a drawbridge, because what queen deserves less than a proper castle entrance? The estimated cost was $2.5 million. In 1900, that sum could buy a fleet of ships or build an entire factory town. George didn't blink. Money was just paper. Louise was everything. Construction began in the spring of 1900. Barges arrived daily, heavy with limestone blocks from quarries on the mainland. Stonemasons from Italy came to shape the exterior, men who learned their craft in the shadow of ancient cathedrals. Carpenters from Germany arrived to create the interior, bringing techniques passed down through generations. 300 workers swarmed the island like ants building a cathedral. George visited constantly, sometimes daily when hotel business allowed. He inspected every detail: the curve of an arch, the placement of a window, the quality of the marble destined for Louise's ballroom. Nothing escaped his attention. This wasn't a construction project. It was a love letter written in stone. Louise visited too, though less frequently. Her health had begun to trouble her. Small things at first: fatigue that lingered too long, headaches that wouldn't fade. George worried, but Louise smiled and told him not to fuss. The castle would be ready soon. They would spend summers there, she promised, growing old together on their island, watching their grandchildren play in gardens built from devotion. The years passed in a blur of hammering and sawing. By 1903, the castle's exterior stood complete. The towers reached skyward, commanding the river with Gothic magnificence. The powerhouse hummed with new machinery. The yacht house waited for boats that would carry the family across the water. The tunnels connected everything underground, a hidden world beneath the visible splendour. Only the interior remained unfinished. Plasterers prepared walls for decoration. Artisans waited to install imported wood panelling. The grand ballroom stood empty, echoing with the footsteps of workers who whispered about the cost of such luxury. Every day brought the dream closer to reality. George felt triumph building in his chest. 4 years of work, 4 years of planning and money and obsessive attention. All of it for Louise. All of it to show her that a poor boy from Prussia could build something that would outlast empires. The completion date was set for early 1904. Just a few more months. Just a few more details. Then Louise would walk through the finished castle and George would see her face light up with joy. That moment would make everything worth it. Every dollar spent, every hour away from her side while he managed the construction, every sacrifice. He imagined her standing in the ballroom, sunlight streaming through stained glass windows, her hand in his, their dream finally real. But some dreams are too beautiful to survive contact with the world. The reality of building a castle demanded more than love and money. It demanded flesh and bone and sweat. 300 men worked the island during peak construction. They lived in temporary barracks on the shoreline, wooden structures that leaked when rain came. They woke before sunrise. They worked until darkness made labour dangerous. 6 days a week, sometimes 7 when deadlines loomed. The pay was decent by the standards of 1900. $2 a day for common labourers. Skilled stonemasons earned 4 or 5, but the work consumed them entirely. Lifting limestone blocks that weighed hundreds of pounds, mixing mortar in huge batches that burned their hands through worn gloves, climbing scaffolding in weather that ranged from blistering summer heat to bitter autumn wind. Men were injured regularly. A stonemason named Antonio Russo fell from scaffolding in August 1901. He broke both legs and an arm. The foreman sent him back to the mainland on a barge, no compensation beyond his final week's pay. His family never heard from the Boldt estate again. Antonio spent the rest of his life limping, unable to work the stone that had been his craft since childhood. A carpenter lost 3 fingers to a saw in the spring of 1902. The accident happened late in the day, when exhaustion made hands slow and mind sluggish. He wrapped the stumps in dirty cloth and kept working for another hour before the pain became unbearable. The doctor on the mainland couldn't save the fingers. The carpenter found different work, but his wage never recovered. These stories were common, not exceptional. The Gilded Age built its monuments on the backs of men, who had no choice but to accept the terms offered. Labour unions existed, but they held little power in remote areas where employers controlled everything. If a man complained, 10 others waited to take his place. The massive immigration from Europe meant workers were abundant and expendable. George C. Boldt was not unusually cruel. By the standards of his era, he was a fair employer. But fairness in 1900 meant something different than it would a century later. Safety regulations didn't exist. Workers' compensation was a foreign concept. If a man got hurt, that was his misfortune. The work continued without pause. The financial demands of Boldt Castle stretched beyond worker wages. Limestone came from quarries in Kingston, Ontario. Each block had to be cut to precise specifications, then loaded onto barges for transport across the river. The quarry owners charged premium prices, knowing George Boldt could afford them. Transportation costs added another layer of expense. Then came the stonemasons' wages to shape and place each block. The powerhouse alone cost $200,000. It required a separate construction team, specialized equipment, and a turbine system sophisticated enough to generate electricity for the entire island. In 1900, most of America still used gas lamps. Boldt wanted electric lights throughout the castle, in every room, creating illumination that would turn night into day. The yacht house cost another $150,000. It wasn't just a building to store boats, it held living quarters for staff, maintenance workshops, and a bowling alley on the second floor. George wanted his family to have entertainment even on rainy days. The bowling alley alone required specialized flooring, imported pins, and a mechanism to reset them that had to be custom built. Then came the landscaping. George hired the Olmsted Brothers, the most prestigious landscape architecture firm in America. They had designed Central Park in New York. They had shaped the grounds of the World's Fair in Chicago. For Boldt Castle, they planned Italian gardens with geometric precision. Marble statues would stand at carefully calculated intervals. Flower beds would bloom in orchestrated colours. Trees would be planted in arrangements that created natural frames for views of the river. The soil itself had to be imported. Hart Island's rocky ground couldn't support the elaborate gardens Louise wanted. Barges brought hundreds of tons of rich soil from the mainland. Workers spread it by hand, layer after layer, building up the earth until it could sustain life. The island's shape was modified, carved and filled, until it resembled a heart when viewed from above. Every flower, every tree, every blade of grass represented money spent and labour performed. The total cost climbed far beyond the initial estimate. By 1903, George had spent close to $3 million. The number kept rising. Imported wood panelling from Europe, stained glass windows crafted by artisans in France, marble fireplaces carved with intricate designs, a grand staircase that spiralled upward through the castle's core, each step cut from single pieces of stone. The wealthy industrialists who visited the Waldorf Astoria whispered about George's obsession. Some admired his devotion, others thought him foolish. $3 million for a summer home. The amount seemed obscene, even by Gilded Age standards. But George didn't care about other men's opinions. He cared about Louise. Every dollar spent was a dollar spent on her happiness. Every stone placed was a stone in the foundation of their future together. The workers on the island understood none of this context. They knew only the immediate reality of their labour. Wake at dawn, work until dusk, eat simple meals, sleep in crowded barracks, send money home to families they hadn't seen in months. Some of the Italian stonemasons carved their names into hidden corners of the castle. Small signatures that would last as long as the stone itself. A declaration that they existed, that they built this, that they weren't just anonymous hands but men with names and lives and pride in their craft. One mason carved a date alongside his name, 1903, Pietro Moretti. He was 19 years old, far from home, working on something he would never be able to afford for himself. But he could shape stone better than most men twice his age. His work would outlast him by centuries. That gave him satisfaction even when his muscles ached and his hands bled. The castle rose higher through 1903, its towers reaching toward completion. The exterior was magnificent. Gothic revival architecture executed with flawless precision. Every window perfectly placed. Every tower properly proportioned. From the river, it looked like something transported from medieval Europe. A fortress of stone that commanded respect and wonder. But the interior remained unfinished. Empty rooms waited for decoration. Walls stood bare, exposing the structure beneath the planned beauty. The grand ballroom echoed with emptiness, waiting for the plaster and paint and imported panelling that would transform it from construction site to elegant space. George pushed for faster completion. He wanted Louise to see the finished castle in the summer of 1904. He wanted her to walk through completed rooms, not construction debris. He increased the workforce. He authorized overtime. He sent urgent telegrams to suppliers, demanding faster delivery. The workers responded with exhausted determination. They understood the pressure, even if they didn't understand the love driving it. Another few months, another few dozen tasks. Then the castle would be complete, and they could move on to other projects, other buildings, other wealthy men with impossible dreams. Winter came to the Thousand Islands with bitter cold. Construction slowed but didn't stop. Men worked with numb fingers, their breath visible in the frozen air. The river began to ice over, making barge deliveries difficult. But George insisted, keep working, keep building. Spring would bring the final push toward completion. Louise's health worsened through the winter. The fatigue grew deeper. The headaches became constant. George brought in the best doctors money could buy. They examined her with grave faces and used medical terminology that explained nothing. Rest, they prescribed. Avoid stress. Let the body heal itself. George agonized over every symptom. He wanted to stop the construction to focus entirely on Louise's care. But she insisted he continue. The castle was almost finished. She wanted to see it complete. She would get better, she promised. Spring would restore her strength. George believed her because the alternative was unbearable. He threw himself into the final details of construction with manic energy. Every completed room was one room closer to Louise's recovery. Every installed window was one window closer to the future they planned together. The workers sensed the urgency in his visits. He inspected their work with sharper attention. He demanded perfection in every detail. A misaligned stone had to be reset. An uneven floor had to be corrected. Nothing could be less than flawless. By January 1904, the castle stood nearly complete. The exterior was finished. Most of the major interior work was done. Only the final decorative elements remained. The imported wood panelling waited in storage. The stained glass windows were ready for installation. The marble fireplaces stood in their designated rooms, needing only final fitting. George felt cautious optimism. A few more months, maybe less. Then Louise would see her castle complete. They would stand together in the finished ballroom, and all the money, all the labour, all the obsessive attention would transform into joy on her face. He didn't know that time had already run out. Louise Augusta Boldt died on January 7, 1904. She was 41 years old. The official cause was heart failure, though the doctors spoke of complications, of systems failing in ways they couldn't fully explain. Modern medicine would probably identify the condition more precisely, but in 1904, all the wealth in America couldn't buy answers that medical science hadn't yet discovered. George was at the Waldorf Astoria when she died. A telegram arrived. Terse, clinical. The words destroyed his world in seconds. He stood in his office, the paper shaking in his hands, unable to comprehend how reality could shift so violently. That morning, he had been planning the castle's final details. Now Louise was gone, not sick, not recovering. Gone. He took a train north immediately. The journey felt eternal. Every mile was torture. Every minute was a reminder that he would never see her smile again, never hear her voice, never feel her hand in his. The castle was days away from completion. Days. She was supposed to see it finished. That was the promise. That was the entire point. When he reached Louise's side, her body was already cold. George stood beside her, looking at the face that had given his life meaning, and felt something break inside himself that would never heal. All his success, all his wealth, all his ambition, none of it could bring her back. He had built an empire from nothing. He had transformed American hospitality. He had commanded the respect of the most powerful men in the nation. But he couldn't save his wife. The funeral was held at the Waldorf Astoria. Hundreds of mourners attended. Industrialists and politicians and society figures came to pay respects. They spoke in hushed voices about what a tragedy it was, how sudden, how unexpected. George heard none of it. He stood in his expensive suit surrounded by luxury he'd created and felt nothing but the vast emptiness where Louise used to be. After the funeral, George sent a telegram to Hart Island. 3 words: stop all construction. The workers received the order with confusion. Stop? Now? The castle was so close to completion. A few more weeks would finish everything. But the telegram was clear. Stop all construction. immediately. The foreman gathered the men and explained. Mrs. Boldt had died. The castle was being abandoned. Pack your tools. Clear the site. The dream was over. The workers couldn't comprehend it. 300 men had spent 4 years building something magnificent. They had poured their sweat and blood into every stone. Pietro Moretti had carved his name into the walls, claiming a small piece of immortality. Antonio Russo had broken his legs. An unnamed carpenter had lost his fingers. All of it for nothing. The castle would stand unfinished, empty, abandoned. The grand ballroom would never host parties. The imported wood panelling would never be installed. The stained glass windows would remain in storage. Everything George had built as a monument to love became a monument to loss. The workers left the island in late January. Some were angry about lost wages. Others were simply sad. They had built something beautiful, and now it would decay untouched. Pietro Moretti looked back at the castle towers as his barge pulled away. His name was in there somewhere, carved in stone, a ghost signature in a building that would never be used. The island fell silent. Winter snow covered the castle, making it look like a fairy tale illustration. But there was no magic in the abandonment. Just empty rooms and unfinished dreams and the weight of grief made tangible in stone. George never returned to Hart Island. He couldn't bear it. Every stone was a reminder of Louise. Every tower was a promise broken by death. He had poured 4 years and $3 million into building her a kingdom, and she would never walk through its doors. The very act of creation, which should have been joy, became torture. He focused on work instead. The Waldorf Astoria needed his attention. His other hotels required management. Throwing himself into business was the only way to avoid thinking about the castle standing empty on its heart-shaped island. But the grief never faded. It lurked beneath every decision, every conversation, every moment of false normalcy. The years passed slowly. George aged rapidly after Louise's death. Photographs from before 1904 show a man in his prime, confident and strong. Photographs after show someone diminished. His eyes held a sadness that no success could erase. He maintained his business empire, but the fire that had driven him across an ocean as a boy was gone. The castle remained abandoned, completely untouched. George paid a caretaker to prevent vandalism, but nothing more. No work was done, no maintenance performed beyond the absolute minimum. The building stood frozen in time, caught between completion and ruin. Nature began to reclaim the island. Vines grew up the exterior walls. Rain leaked through unfinished sections of roof, damaging the interior. Windows that were never properly sealed let in wind and weather. The carefully planned Italian gardens grew wild, flowers and hedges escaping their geometric designs. Locals from nearby towns would occasionally boat past the island. They saw the castle towers rising above the trees and wondered about the wealthy man who built something so grand and then abandoned it. Stories circulated. Some said the castle was haunted by Mrs. Boldt's ghost. Others claimed George Boldt had gone mad with grief. The truth was simpler and sadder than any ghost story. A man loved his wife. He built her a castle. She died before it was finished. He couldn't bear to complete what she would never see. George C. Boldt died on December 5th, 1916. He was 65 years old. He had lived 12 years beyond Louise, 12 years of success that felt hollow, 12 years of wealth that couldn't buy what he wanted. He died in his apartment at the Waldorf Astoria, surrounded by luxury, alone with grief that never diminished. His will made no mention of Boldt Castle. The property passed to his children, who had no interest in completing their father's dream. It was too painful, too expensive, too much a reminder of loss. They left the castle exactly as George had left it, unfinished, abandoned, slowly decaying. The Boldt children eventually sold the island. The new owners did nothing with it. Then it sold again, and again. Each owner saw the castle and imagined profit, but the cost of completion was staggering. The building had been exposed to weather for years. Water damage had weakened structures. Winters had frozen and cracked stone. The imported materials in storage had rotted or been stolen. Restoring the castle would cost as much as building it originally. No private owner could justify that expense. So the castle continued its slow decay, becoming more ruin than building with each passing year. Decades passed. The castle became a curiosity, then a forgotten landmark, then almost a myth. Old-timers remembered the millionaire who built it for his wife. Younger people knew it only as the abandoned castle on the island, dangerous and off-limits. By the 1970s, Boldt Castle was in severe danger of complete collapse. 70 years of neglect had taken a brutal toll. Walls were crumbling. Towers were structurally unsound. The interior was destroyed by water, ice, and vandals who broke in despite the caretaker's best efforts. It seemed likely the castle would simply fall, collapsing into rubble, erased from existence by time and weather and abandonment. But then something unexpected happened. Something George C. Boldt never could have predicted when he sent that 3-word telegram in 1904. People started to care. The Thousand Islands Bridge Authority acquired Boldt Castle in 1977. They paid $1 for the property. $1 single for a castle that had cost $3 million to build. The previous owners were desperate to offload it. The liability of owning a crumbling structure outweighed any potential value. So the Bridge Authority, a government agency responsible for maintaining the international bridge connecting the United States and Canada, took possession. Their motivation wasn't profit. It was preservation. The castle had become part of the region's identity. Locals had grown up seeing its towers across the water. Tour boat operators pointed it out to visitors. It was a landmark, even in ruins. Letting it collapse entirely would mean losing something that had become woven into the landscape's story. But preservation required money, massive amounts of it. The Bridge Authority couldn't fund restoration through taxes or government appropriations. They needed another approach. So they made a decision that George C. Boldt might have found either perfect or horrifying. They opened Boldt Castle to tourists. In the summer of 1977, visitors could pay a small fee to tour the abandoned castle. They walked through rooms open to the sky where roofs had collapsed. They climbed stairs that ended in mid-air where floors had rotted away. They saw the skeleton of George's dream, the bare bones of love made tangible in decaying stone. The tours were immediately popular. Thousands came that first summer. People were fascinated by the story. A millionaire builds a castle for his wife. She dies before it's completed. He abandons it forever. The narrative had everything: love, wealth, tragedy, loss. The admission fees funded initial stabilization work. Structural engineers shored up walls that were close to collapse. Roofers covered open sections to prevent further water damage. Stonemasons repaired the most critical deterioration. The work was slow and expensive, but it was happening. The castle was being saved. Each summer brought more visitors and more restoration funding. By the 1980s, significant progress was visible. Rooms that had been open to weather were now enclosed. Floors that had collapsed were rebuilt. The grand staircase, which had been structurally unsound, was reinforced and restored to its original spiral beauty. The Bridge Authority made a crucial decision about the restoration's philosophy. They wouldn't try to complete George's original vision. Too much time had passed. The detailed plans were lost or outdated. Trying to finish the castle as George intended would be impossible and inappropriate. Instead, they would restore what existed and interpret what was lost. Each room would be brought back to stability and beauty, but with acknowledgement of the castle's interrupted history. Plaques would explain what George had planned. Photographs would show what might have been. But the restoration would honour the abandonment as much as the creation. This approach meant the castle became something unique. Not a museum pretending history was preserved in amber, not a modern interpretation disguised as historical authenticity. Instead, Boldt Castle became a monument to both love and loss, to dreams and their destruction, to the gap between intention and reality. The yacht house was fully restored by the 1960s. Visitors could tour the bowling alley George had built for rainy day entertainment. They could see the living quarters designed for staff who never came. The building stood complete and beautiful, exactly as George had envisioned, surrounded by gardens that were being restored to their original geometric precision. The powerhouse was restored and put back into operation. The original turbine system, incredibly, still worked after decades of neglect. Engineers cleaned and repaired it, and the powerhouse once again generated electricity for the island. Modern systems were added, but the core machinery was George's original equipment, still performing its intended function a century later. The castle's interior rooms were restored floor by floor, year by year. The grand ballroom received new plaster and paint. Not the exact materials George had chosen, those were lost to time, but approximations based on research and period-appropriate selections. The room became magnificent, a space where Louise might have danced if fate had been kinder. Stained glass windows were installed in key locations. Not George's original imported pieces, those had disappeared decades ago, but new works created by modern artisans who studied the period and style. Light streamed through coloured glass, creating the luminous atmosphere George had imagined. The Italian gardens were replanted and maintained. Hedges were trimmed into geometric shapes. Flower beds bloomed in carefully orchestrated colours. Marble statues stood at calculated intervals. The Olmsted brothers' original design was honoured and recreated, turning the island back into the manicured paradise George had commissioned. By the 2000s, Boldt Castle had been transformed. Not completed, it would never be completed in the way George intended, but restored, saved from collapse, brought back from ruin. Over 200,000 visitors toured the island each summer season, walking through a building that had once stood days away from completion before being abandoned for 70 years. The story resonated with people in ways the Bridge Authority hadn't fully anticipated. Visitors weren't just curious about historical architecture or wealthy lifestyles. They were moved by the love story. They connected with the grief. They understood the hollow feeling of putting everything into something, only to have it taken away. Letters arrived at the Bridge Authority offices. People thanked them for saving the castle. Some shared their own stories of loss. A woman who lost her husband months before their dream home was completed. A man who spent years planning a future with someone who died suddenly. The castle became a place where grief felt understood, where the expression of love through building didn't seem excessive or foolish, but deeply human. George C. Boldt would likely be bewildered by what his castle became. He never intended it as a public attraction. He built it for Louise alone, for their private summers together. But he might also find something fitting in the transformation. His love for Louise, which he tried to express in stone, reached thousands of people who never knew either of them. The emotion he felt, the grief that destroyed his ability to continue, touched strangers across a century. The castle stands complete now in every way except one. It will never be what George imagined. Louise never walked through its doors. The original vision, the complete fulfillment of that obsessive devotion, remains impossible. Some gaps can't be bridged no matter how much money or time or effort is applied. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps Boldt Castle is more powerful as a monument to interrupted dreams than it could ever have been as a completed summer home. The abandonment became part of its meaning. The grief became inseparable from the love. You can't tell one part of the story without the other. Standing in the grand ballroom today, surrounded by restored beauty, you can almost see them. George and Louise, young and in love, planning their future. He's showing her the architectural drawings. She's laughing at his enthusiasm, touching his hand, telling him it's too much. He's insisting nothing is too much for her. She's agreeing because she knows how he loves through action, through building, through creating something permanent in a world of temporary things. But then the image fades, because Louise never stood in this room. She died in a different place, surrounded by different walls, and George never returned after her death, couldn't bear to see what they had planned together transformed into a reminder of what he lost. The castle is beautiful. The restoration is remarkable. The gardens are pristine. But underneath all that beauty is absence. The gap where Louise should be. The silence where her laughter should echo. The emptiness where their shared future should exist. Some things can't be restored. Can't be rebuilt. Can't be brought back no matter how much we want them. George C. Boldt learned that lesson in the worst possible way. He thought he could build permanence. He thought stone and money and obsessive attention could create something that would last forever. But love isn't preserved in architecture. It exists in moments, in breath, in the fleeting warmth of another person's presence. When that presence vanishes, no castle can replace it. No amount of restored beauty can fill the void. No number of tourists walking through can undo the abandonment. But perhaps there's meaning in the attempt. Perhaps George's obsessive devotion, as tragic as its conclusion was, represents something true about love itself. We pour ourselves into gestures that can never fully capture what we feel. We build and give and promise, knowing that nothing we create will last forever. We do it anyway because the alternative, loving less, building less, giving less, feels worse than the inevitable loss. Boldt Castle stands as a testament to that impulse, to love that exceeds reason, to dreams that outpace reality, to the human need to make permanent what we know is temporary. George failed to complete what he started. But his failure is more moving than most people's successes, because he tried to build the impossible, and when he couldn't finish, he left it exactly as it was the day Louise died. The abandonment was its own kind of monument, a refusal to pretend life could continue unchanged, a declaration that some losses are too great to work around. For 70 years, that empty castle sat frozen in grief, and maybe that was exactly what it needed to be. Now it stands restored, filled with visitors, alive with footsteps and voices. George would probably hate it. But Louise might understand. She might see all those people moved by their story and feel something like peace. Her death destroyed George's dream. But it also created something else. A place where love and loss exist together, where the beauty of what was built can coexist with the tragedy of what was lost. That balance, that acceptance of both joy and grief, might be the closest any of us come to building something that lasts. Not in stone, not in perfect preservation, but in the way stories move through time, connecting people across generations through shared emotion. George C. Boldt wanted to give Louise a castle. He succeeded, just not in the way he intended. The castle stands, people visit, his love for her is remembered, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's more than most of us will leave behind. The stone remains, the story endures, and somewhere in the restored ballroom, if you're quiet enough, you can almost hear music that was never played, for a dance that never happened, in a love that refused to be forgotten. The Thousand Islands hold many stories like this one. Millionaires' dreams built in stone, families who poured fortunes into summer estates. Some succeeded, some failed. Each one has its own tale of ambition, sacrifice, and legacy. What other estate should we explore? Which mansion story deserves to be told? Let me know in the comments, and if this story moved you, if George and Louise's tragedy resonated, hit that like button and subscribe. There are more stories waiting to be uncovered, more histories hiding in